Right on time, but given the demographics, it's very understandable. Welcome to the second Embassy Speaker Series of 2014. We're very pleased and honored to have you join us today for an interesting conversation with a renowned Korean Canadian. But first, please welcome Ambassador Jo Hee-young for the opening remarks and for the introduction of our speaker today.
The Commodore, Dr. Hans Jung and Mrs. Jung, and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the embassy, and thank you all for being here this evening. And first, I'd like to express my deep gratitude for your interest in Korea and full support for the advancement of bilateral relations between Canada and Korea. And of course, that I know there are some military attaché from other embassies. Of course, that thank you very much for your full support for the advancement of the relations between your country and Korea too. With respect to the relations between Korea and Canada, we two countries have steadily developed a special partnership based upon our shared history, common values, robust economic ties, and people-to-people connections. In fact, over the more than 6 decades, we have achieved country successes together as staunch allies, ideal partners, and like-minded countries. Well, generally speaking, I can say we have enjoyed the excellent bilateral relations between our two countries. Especially this year, we have very good news. In March, on the heels of the 2013 history year, marking the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties between our two countries and 60th anniversary of Korean armistice, the President Park Geun-hye and Prime Minister Harper declared a successful conclusion of negotiation for the landmark free trade agreement. This free trade agreement will unlock the full potential of economic relations between our two countries and bring significant benefits to Canadians and Koreans alike. And of course, the potential effect of the free trade agreement will extend beyond economic relevance. It will upgrade bilateral relations in all areas of common interest and lay the foundation for a new era of mutually beneficial political and economic, cultural, and people-to-people relations. In terms of the people-to-people relations, the free trade agreement is truly meaningful. It is testament to the historically rich ties between our two peoples. It is a testament to the strong the influence and contribution of the Korean-Canadian community here in Canada, especially in building bridges between our two peoples. To celebrate this rich people-to-people relations, we are honored to have a special speaker who stands out as a true role model within the Korean Canadian community, and who has achieved a very important impact on the Canadian society. Commodore Dr. Hans Jung, a retired Surgeon General in the Canadian Armed Forces, will share with us his personal journey and experiences working as a physician leader in the military. Dr. Hans Jung immigrated to Canada from Korea as a child without knowing a single words of English. Is that right? Raised with a strong sense of duty and commitment to promote Canadian values, Dr. Jung enlisted in the Navy. He went on to complete his medical training and rose steadily through the ranks, becoming the first member of a visible minority group to be promoted to a general in Canadian Forces history. Dr. Jung achieved extraordinary success as a leader in the Canadian Forces. His contributions have been significant and have helped change the face of healthcare in the military. After 31 years of service to Canada, Dr. Jung is regarded as one of this country's most celebrated leaders and an example of a true immigrant success story. Dr. Jung's incredible personal journey and outstanding achievements in Canadian Armed Forces are an inspiration to generations of Koreans and Canadians. I'm sure that we will all learn a great deal from his presentation. Commodore Dr. Jung, let me extend our sincere appreciation for your presence and welcome to the stand. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's good. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for those kind words. Senators, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and my colleagues in the military, both Canada and international, and my special thanks to the Korean War Veterans for being here today. Thank you very much. My topic today will be in three parts, more or less hockey period 1, 2, and 3. The first one will be personal journey. I'm not really going to spend too much time on that, but simply as a segue into the second part, which is talking about diversity, and then the third part is my personal experience and observation about the healthcare to the military and the veterans. I guess I bring a unique perspective here because not only having served 31 years and retired as a Surgeon General, but also I think I'm the only one also running a purely veterans medical clinic once after retirement, looking after solely dedicated to the veterans of military and also the RCMP. So I bring a dynamic or perspective that is sort of continuous from the military to retirement and into the and becoming a veteran and trying to access healthcare in that continuum. And of course, there's lots of political debate going on right now on that issue. So throughout the three topics, as is my wont, I'll probably make some provocative statements, and some of my colleagues would attest to that habit from time to time. To start off, again, my personal journey, and again, as is my history, I used to be asked to provide my speeches when I was Surgeon General, and it was always in point form because I never read anything. It was just sort of guide to what I'm going to say. So basically, my journey into Canada started in 1970. We arrived as a family to Canada in 18th of January 1970 to the city of Winnipeg. As you can imagine, that was a very cold introduction to Canada. And as the ambassador stated, we really didn't know a word of English, and perhaps because of lack of internet and so on, the country seemed to be perceived to be much more safe environment. So basically, literally the day after we arrived, we were enrolled in school, and I had to take a bus to school. And there was you had to get off the bus, wait for another bus, and transfer it over. And when you don't speak the language, and you have to look at the bus signs to change buses, that's a little more difficult because it's like if you were today asked to take a bus based upon Egyptian hieroglyphs. Basically, it was a picture. So you have to sort of look at the little sign that my father gave me and try to figure out which bus it was. And sure enough, I got on the bus, and lo and behold, the bus driver changed the sign. It wasn't the right one. So I was on the wrong bus. And I knew that from looking inside the bus, looking at the sign. And for those of you old enough, you remember they weren't electronic. It was one of those roll things. So I have to read it now, hieroglyphics. inside out and realized that I was on the wrong bus. Now, my father, as a wise man, perhaps anticipated this, so he gave me another piece of it. If you think you're lost, give this to the bus driver. So I did, and he gave me a transfer bus, and I knew enough to get to the school. We were about an hour late. The principal was really worried, but we got there okay. So that was sort of my first introduction to Canada. And often, retired now, people may think that life was pretty good and so forth, but like a lot of immigrant story, it was not an easy upbringing. Coming to Canada in 1970, where Korea at the time was truly a developing country, we were only allowed to come over with $100 US. That's all we had. So we came that way. We arrived in Winnipeg, nowhere dressed with that kind of clothing. So for about the first 2 years, we lived on secondhand clothing that other people generally donated. But because of the Korean work ethics, self-sufficiency, hard work, and doing your best rather than trying to depend on other people, it was basically about living within your means and working and working and working to try to overcome whatever adversity rather than trying to look for your entitlements and what your benefits have. So it was basically really about hard work and living within your means, as I said. And in 1970, when you were a visible minority, you were visible. Because at that time, based upon the census, only 2% of the population in Canada was visible. And in certain cities, even less so. So that was truly visible. But growing up in Canada, even in those early years, I remember listening to a radio broadcast. I think perhaps it was one of the early black and white TV show, and I remember seeing I can't remember whether it was I saw, but I heard a speech that was given by President John F. Kennedy. It was obviously before then, but it was a powerful speech, and the one that I sort of re-emphasized the work ethics of hard work, self-sufficiency, and moving on. Basically, the quote said, "Do not ask what this country can do for you." It said, "Ask what you can do for this country." And I took away from that basically meaning self-sufficiency. You shouldn't expect other people to come to your aid when you haven't done your utmost to improve your own lot. So it was really about hard work and getting on with life. And of course, Canada was a wonderful country. I mean, it gave you the opportunity. Now, nobody guarantees you an equal outcome, but it gives you a reasonable equal opportunity, and it's up to you to work hard to get there. And of course, so part and parcel with that is that life is never fair, but get over it. And people say Bill Gates said that, but actually he didn't. It was somebody named Sykes or somebody, and it's a different author. But fundamentally, it sort of also sort of re-emphasized JFK's comment about what you can do. But it's up to you to make the best of yourself and make the best of your lot and move ahead and not complain about what life has thrown at you. You have to work hard to overcome that adversity. And so there's a lot of hard work, no doubt about it, and lots of you blank out a lot of the negative things, and early sort of overt racism and things like that. But no country is perfect, and of all the countries, Canada still was, in my mind, one of the best countries. So you put that aside, and you don't brush the whole country based upon few individuals' bad actions, but you look at the whole country, and then you work hard. And without a doubt, we worked very, very hard, and obviously with a certain amount of luck involved. In 1980, I was able to apply to med school and get accepted at the University of Toronto Med School. And of course, as soon as I got accepted into medical school, I went to the recruiting center and I enrolled. And it wasn't for money at the time, although it turns out that they did pay for your tuition and there was a little bit of a stipend, but I didn't know about that. In those days, there was no internet, so you couldn't read it, look it up. You just sort of went down there and enrolled. And why did I do that? I guess part of it was my sense was, you had to pay back. There was certain civic duty. Having sort of benefited from the society, you had to say, well, what do I do to pay back to society, as John F. Kennedy said, ask what you can do for this country. And for me, serving in the military, I felt was a good way to pay back or to respond to your civic responsibility. And at the end of the day, for a sense of your citizenship. I mean, if you come to Canada, Canada accepts you, what better way to be willing to serve and, depending on the circumstances, put your life on the line. And of course, we did that. I mean, I went to the Gulf War, and that we've been involved in a number of other operations since that time. But it was a sense of civic responsibility and sense of citizenship that I felt I needed to do this. But I never planned a career. I was going to do this for 3-4 years, serve, so in a sense like I've paid back, and then move back into civilian practice. But once I was in the uniform, it was so much fun, so much opportunity to lead. There was no reason to leave. So we just sort of stayed, and lo and behold, 31 years go by before you blink of an eye, and now you're time to retire. So it's, so I guess when you're having fun, why leave? And people, that's why I tell people, don't leave, go somewhere. So it's slightly different context, and and also you have to find the time to leave. You always leave when you're at your highest in your game. Don't leave when people are waiting for you to vacate your seat. And so I thought, I had the time, and we had a great. In fact, my career culminated in Afghanistan, and we did a great job as a team, and we closed our field hospital in Afghanistan. I think time was right for me to leave and a new chapter and leave it for my successors to flip the chapter for the next one. So, and the other part, I guess, it was when I was thinking about that was, it was not lost in me when I was thinking about, joining the military that, when Korean War started, UN and Canadian soldiers participated in that activity, in that war. And I'm sure most people didn't even know where Korea was at the time. But why did they do that? Regardless of what individual reasons were, the fact was they participated, they were involved, they put their life on the line, and it was because of that that at least the Southern Korea was liberated. That allowed me ultimately to come to Canada. So for me, it was closing the loop. For me to serve in the same Canadian forces and pay back in that way. So that was one of the, that fact was not lost in me in my decision-making process. So I've served my whole adult career in the military, both in war and peace, and we've done a number of wonderful things, and I enjoyed every minute of it. And people now ask me, what do you miss the most? Well, obviously I miss my colleagues, but I miss wearing that uniform. It's a nice uniform. Yes. And I guess in some ways also perhaps my first provocative statement here is that Canadians love the hyphenated Canadians, Korean Canadian, Japanese Canadian, Chinese Canadian, English Canadian, French Canadian. I don't like it. I'm not a fan of hyphenated Canadian because to me it's divisive. You are simply saying people, well, we're not all Canadians, we're just a little bit different. Having served, and I think, 44 years in my life in Canada and 31 years in the military, I personally feel I've earned the right to be called simply a Canadian. But a Canadian, without a doubt, with a strong and proud Korean heritage, but a Canadian first and foremost. So that's my first comment, is I'm not a big fan of hyphenated Canadians. So now let me quickly, using that as a sort of an introduction, move on to diversity in the Canadian Forces. And it's kind of timely, I guess, because about 2-3 weeks ago there was an article in the Ottawa Citizen about diversity in Canada. And there was a significant amount of criticism because Canadian Forces was not meeting its target and that they were proposing to lower the target for the subsequent years or whatever. And the current percentage, I guess, and in this case I'll just talk about the women and visible minority, is 15% of the current Canadian forces is women, and 4% are visible minority. But the target was 25% for women and 12% for visible minority. And the proposed target is lower at 18% for women and 8% for visible minority. And there was a lot of criticism on this because of sort of sense of inertia, and they haven't done anything to really improve that situation over the last decade almost. And so the numbers are based upon what's called proportional or statistical representation, meaning that the Canadian Forces should try to be close to the population distribution of its demographics, meaning women are 50%, so 50% ideally, and visible minorities compared to 1970, 2%. In 2011, the census was almost 20%. So that the idea is that visible minorities should be 20% of the Canadian military population as a proportional statistical representation, and this is all wrong, obviously. That's my second provocative comment. Now let me talk really about regular force only, because reserve force in the military has a slightly different dynamics, and it's actually somewhat different. So we shouldn't try to combine apples and oranges. And if you are really interested on this diversity issue, you can just Google, can the Canadian Forces reflect Canadian society? Because I wrote an article in the Canadian Military Journal in about 2006 on this issue, basically anticipating the criticism that we just got. And if you really want to look deeply into that one, you can read the 65-page report I wrote at the Staff College, and you can get a full answer to various complexities involved. But the whole idea of setting targets started in around 1997, and when Environics Canada did a survey. And they asked visible minorities, of their what they call propensity or the interest to serve in the military. And so when they asked them, 12% said they were very interested in joining the military, and 21% said they were somewhat interested in joining the military. So when you add up the somewhat and the very, it comes to about 31%. So they used that 31% to then discuss and argue as to, well, what should be the representation? So if you do the straight math, 31% of the people who are interested, and there's 20%, well, you're down to about 8% of people who may be interested truly in the military. But this is they say about statistics being their lives, they analyze in their statistics. So the survey is non-contextualized. People, so it's like if you ask Canadian populations, do you agree with the statement that Canadian Forces is a respected and valued institution? Well, when you add up, I agree very much, and I somewhat agree, you would come up to probably about the high 80, 90% in terms of people respecting, the institution of the Canadian military. And if you say, wow, Canadians value Canadian Forces by about 85 to 95%, then there should be no problem of getting funding, and defense budget should be not an issue in isolation. But if you then ask people, rank the military in spite of your values, amongst other things, then it comes way behind education, healthcare, environment, Aboriginal affairs. Number of other things are much higher than priority. So if you take it in isolation, it sounds much more impressive. But if you put it in contextualized, so are you very interested in the military, but would you do that ahead of becoming an engineer, becoming a businessman? It falls much lower. So when they asked people who are very interested in joining the military, how likely are you to go to actually to a recruit center to turn that intent into action? All of the 12% who said that, 35% of those said, I would be very likely to go to a recruit center. So that actually then comes out to 4.5%. So it's much lower. But even there is not the end of the story, right? Because why do immigrants come to Canada? So if you look at the StatsCan study, I said 20% today, 65% of the immigrants or visible minorities in Canada, of the 20% in Canada, 65% are first generation. And the biggest reason they come to Canada is economic reasons. They come to Canada to have a better economic future. Second biggest immigration group is their families, which are usually their elder parents, generally speaking. And the third distant group are refugees. Now, most of the visible minorities come to Canada to become more economically prosperous and have more freedom and so on. Very few of these people come from countries where the military is seen as the highest prospect in terms of what they want their children to be raised to. There's lots of issues about human rights and so forth. So being an officer or being a member of the Canadian Forces or being a member of the military is not something most immigrants aspire to when they say, I'm going to go to Canada to join the military. This is not why they come to Canada, okay? On top of that, of this 20%, 10% are women. And Canadian women, target is 25%, but only 15% of the Canadian women are actually in the military. And most of the immigrants who come to Canada, the countries are very much more patriarchal. Women don't, in those countries, immigrants, first generation especially, don't come to Canada and say, boy, I couldn't join the military in my home country, so I'm going to join the military in Canada. It's not going to happen, okay? So when you look at all those contexts, the number, the target that the DND or the Canadian Forces came up with is totally non-contextualized and is much, much more optimistic than the reality. Another part is that you can become a professor in a different university or different country even, and they come to Canada, and you can, depending on your background and your research and so on, you could come to University of Ottawa and get a job as a professor. But in the military, you have to start at the bottom. So if you're an NCM, private. If you're an officer, second lieutenant. And it takes 20 plus years to rise up to the ranks. And there's attrition. So if 100 people join, maybe 20 years later, if you're lucky, maybe you got 10 left. So even if you had a wave of new immigrants join the military, it's going to take 20 years for that number to distribute itself over the course. So the lag time further complicates the diversity issue of trying to reach the goal. So the issue of diversity and the proportional representation is very, very much more complex than what the argument that they're using thus far. So the other part of it is, if the 65% of our first generation immigrants, how many of them are military age? I mean, most people who join the military are under the age of 30. So when you look at all these various factors, you start to realize the true percentage that are amenable to join the military is now dwindling to under 5% most likely. And lo and behold, current presentation is 4%. So if you look at all of that, I actually think the appropriate target is actually about 5%, not higher than that. And this is something that I stated in my paper. And so rather than what's called proportional representation, Canadian Forces should be using delegative representation. And I believe this is what the United Kingdom does. It's called delegative representation, recognizing that you are not going to reach any kind of proportionality until you have good number of second, third generation Canadian immigrant family who have second, third generation Canadians who are more likely to develop more common Canadian values. Okay, so and there's still a debate. And when I was writing this paper in 2006, I actually went down to the diversity section. There's a group of people who do this kind of stuff about employment equity and diversity in Canadian Forces. And while there were a number of women in that section, all the people were writing policies, not a single visible minority in sight, right? So I sympathize, because what's happening is that if you're white and you say things like what I just said, you'll be charged or accused of racism or downplaying. It's a political correctness. Certain things people can't say unless you belong to the group that is supposedly underrepresented. So that's my provocative statement here, that I think Canadian Forces is well represented with diversity, given the context what I've just gone through. And just that somebody just has to stick with it and make that argument. And nobody has done that, and I suspect because whoever is in charge is not visible minority, and they have a hard time saying it. So, in my paper, I actually stated the date, and I quote this, and I'll quote exactly what I said in 2006, and it's again, I think it has come to fruition in a way. I said the dangers of improper target setting will lead to a situation whereby the Kenyan Armed Forces will be perennially unable to meet its target, no matter the effort. It will inevitably lead to criticism of the Kenyan Armed Forces that will only further entrench the perception of organizational inertia and systemic racism. And if you read the sort of articles and some of the political commentaries, that's sort of what it was suggesting, that the military was just too lazy, wasn't really interested in it, and therefore was very critical of its inability or unwillingness even to address what I believe, from my personal experience, militaries are truly a meritocracy. And as I said, it takes time for the representation to roll up through the various rank system. And I think maybe in another 20 years or so, things will change. Now the reserves are a little bit different. Reserves, in fact, have a much higher representation, because a reservist can pursue their economic dream of becoming an engineer, businessman, whatever, because they can work part-time as a reservist in their own community. Because many of the, particularly 1.5 generation, they're not too keen on being posted everywhere every few years. So there are many cultural issues that also limit that. An interesting evolving knowledge about second and third generation, however, is a little bit more ominous. In UK, in particular, I believe that's what the statement was, that if the second and third generation immigrants, or second, third generation children of the immigrants, for whatever reason, do not feel that they are included in the greater society, they will actually become more entrenched in the enclaves and sort of old values, and ergo the development of homegrown terrorism and things of that nature. So while there is optimism, I think we need to, as a society, be careful to be inclusive and as I say, give that opportunity, not necessarily equal outcome, but the opportunity to prosper and succeed in Canada. And I think of all the countries in the world, Canada's probably in the lead in doing that. So I'm very optimistic that down the line, we will have much greater representation in the system. Like I said, it took me 27 years before I became a Surgeon General. So you have to stick with it. And how many people join and then decide to change career? Today's, according to new media and so forth, every 5 years, younger generation are changing jobs. Well, you got to stick with it for 27 years to reach that level. So there's another challenge built into the generation culture issue. So let me now turn to healthcare support. As I said, I have a unique perspective on both military and veterans. So let me first state that medicine, or the practice of medicine, is really about evidence, or it's informed by evidence. It's evidence-based medicine, that's what the term they used. So while medicine, or the practice of medicine, is very much science and evidence-based, healthcare is fundamentally politics. Okay? So there's a fundamental difference. Healthcare is all about politics, because it's ultimately our tax dollars and our representatives who decide where we're going to put that money. But the physicians and other healthcare practitioners who are practicing medicine, they're practicing based upon best evidence at the time. But the healthcare policies are not made by clinicians. It's a political adventure, if you like. So keeping that in mind, acute care has been extremely well looked after around the world, and military is no different. During the Afghanistan campaign, we had the best acute care medicine in the history of warfare. Our military hospital had a 97% survival rate. If you arrived at the Royal 3 Hospital in Kandahar, run by the Canadians, 97% of the people who arrived were going to leave alive. That kind of achievement is unheard of in the history of warfare. Okay? So acute care is fantastic. But there are lots of similarities between civilian healthcare and military healthcare, in that both in the civilian healthcare, acute care is quite good. nobody, if you have a heart attack, best care, auto heart is to Toronto, no matter where you go. Generally speaking, you're going to need great acute care. But by definition, chronic care is not as great because, well, it's inherent in the term. It's chronic. It means you can't cure it. So if you can't cure it, of course, you're not going to be as happy. So chronic care is much more challenging in the whole healthcare system. And when we talk about chronic care in the military now, of course, the most common one we talk about is mental health, PTSD, depression, a number of other things. Mental health presents a uniquely challenging paradigm even with chronic care because very few people with mental health present early. You know, like any disease, the earlier you present, earlier you try to intervene, the better the outcome. But mental health care, there's usually significant lag time. Partly because it requires self-identification. The individual has to recognize. Now, again, for some of the older generation, you may recall in the 80s, and I think the late 70s, there was a lot of media report about recognizing heart attacks because people were dying because they thought they were having indigestion. And there were television and pamphlets, all kinds of things to educate people that, you know, if you feel short of breath, feel nauseous, you got sort of neck pain, arm pain, and so forth. Maybe it's not indigestion, it may be a harbinger of a heart attack, and go see your doctor, go to the emergency immediately. That kind of an advertisement doesn't exist anymore. Almost everybody knows that now. In a similar way, what constitutes early symptoms of mental health is really poorly known by most of the population. So they don't present early. It's assumed that's just the way they are. And of course, your personality changes very gradually. So if it changes gradually, just like you don't notice your kids growing up, if things change gradually, you don't actually notice it, unless somebody else who hasn't seen you for a long time sees you and says, ooh, what happened to you? So mental health is challenging because even heart attack, even if you say, oh, I'm fine, I can put an EKG machine on you and say, you had a heart attack, I can tell. There's an objective finding. There are lots of diagnostic tools for lots of acute care. But I can't plug somebody in and say, oh, you have PTSD. Because you have to say, you have to be honest with all your symptoms and sort of interview. If you say, oh, everything's fine, nobody can read your mind and no diagnosis made. So it's a self-identification and people have to understand it. And there are many, many systemic barriers to why people don't present early. Number one, most people talk about is stigma. You know, the stigma and people, how it's embarrassing, it's humiliating to be, you're weak if you have PTSD. Another one, as I talk about, is self-perception. How do the individual who is actually perhaps suffering, how do they perceive themselves? Do they think they're perfectly fine? Or are they embarrassed about the situation, they're trying to hide it, or what? So perception is an issue. Do you have a supportive work environment? Do your colleagues, are they going to look at you as a loser if you have present yourself with a mental health condition, or are they going to be very supportive? What kind of a family upbringing did you have? Did you have a supportive family? Were you abused as a child, mentally, physically? And what kind of family support do you have now? And social support, friends. All those things have an impact on your ability. What are your finances? If your finances are not good, then that's going to complicate the situation because you don't want to potentially say anything that might jeopardize your career, your job, what have you. And then, of course, along the way, if you become addicted because you're self-medicating with alcohol or drugs or what have you, that even further up because you may have legal issues now and a number of other factors come in that may even further jeopardize. And of course, the mental health diagnosis itself may change your cognition. You may not be thinking because of the disease itself. I mean, if you break a bone, it hurts. Your mind is going to look at that and leg all twisted up. Oh, I think I better go to the hospital. You're not going to try to convince, well, you know, maybe it'll snap back to you tomorrow. Chances are you're not going to think that way. But if you have a mental health condition, you may actually convince yourself that nothing is wrong. So the disease itself changes the cognition and your ability to think logically and perceive the real situation. So these are all very complicating and sort of systemic issues that impede early treatment of mental health, and therefore, by definition, it's chronic. The condition often becomes chronic. So if you look at the Canadian Forces healthcare system today, It is truly an integrated healthcare system. It is second to none. And practicing in the civilian sector now, the Ontario government is trying to emulate what the military has, an integrated holistic care with physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, medical technicians, pharmacists, lab techs, social workers, psychologists, pastoral counselors. It's all there in one setting. It's usually single, one-stop shopping, and that's what the government is trying to produce. And more or less, it's fully funded. Nobody in the military has to worry about, oh, I can't pay for the pharmacy drug, because there's no co-payment, there's no insurance, nothing. Everything is given to you. And if you need treatment, there's no limit. Civilian, you know, if you need to see a psychologist, usually the public service healthcare plan gives you $1,000 a year. That's about 8 treatments, and then you pay your own of $150 an hour. Military, if you need it, you get it. There's no, in the military, you get everything you need, not everything you want. You get everything you need. And it is one of the best staffed healthcare organizations in Canada, without a doubt, bar none. If you don't trust me, look up the numbers. Throw away the emotion, look at the numbers, and you will find that it is one of the best. But all of this is useless if the person in need doesn't access it, right? So you have all the system available, but if you don't access it, and you self-medicate and so forth, and you go down a spiral, none of that means anything, because you have to get care. And so not only is it, do they not seek care early, often when they come, they're so far down the spiral, it is now much more difficult to treat. Just as a cancer treated very early is more likely to be cured, versus a cancer that is now metastasized all over the body, similar to mental health. If it's early, much more likely you're going to treat it and cure it than somebody who's now further down the chain. But the challenge, of course, is that just like cancer and just like heart attack, the best medicine still can't cure everybody with cancer, cannot reverse a heart attack. Okay? Same thing with mental health. Even with the best of care, some people are not going to get cured. They're going to be chronic. And of course, when it's your mind, you're much more unhappy about that than if it's more or less anything else. So often people equate lack of a full cure as lack of good care. And of course, that's a false equation. So there is this perception, no cure equals poor care. Now, but if you're in the military, if you're in uniform, you've got the best system, not the perfect system, but you've got the best system there is in my estimation. If you're a veteran, slightly different story. When you leave the system, now you have to navigate 2 systems. You have to have a civilian healthcare system, which most people don't have. I give patients, military guys retire, I said, here's your prescription. And they say to me, well, what do I do with that? Because in the military, they just go down the hallway, there's a pharmacy there, and they give it to you. Now you have to go to a pharmacy, you have to show your public service healthcare card, you have to show your VAT card, and there's a co-payment involved, and sometimes you pay, sometimes they bill directly. So it's even as simple as that, they're not used to it. You know, so you have 2 systems. You have a civilian healthcare system, and you have a Veterans Affairs Canada bureaucracy to deal with. And none of the system really is designed for veterans. It's designed for the general population, except for the Operation Stress Injury clinics that are in about 7 different sites across Canada that is funded by VAC. And there are funding limits. You know, you can't get everything you need because there's a limit how much, and even if you want more, you have to go through hoops to try to get authority for that. So there's a much longer wait list for anything you want to get in the civilian healthcare system right now. And worst of all, many people, when they leave the military, there's no family doctor to help them navigate the system. If you don't have a family doctor, it's very difficult to navigate the Veterans Affairs and other systems because you need a family doctor to do a lot of this stuff. And there's co-payments. So some people, if they leave the military too early or for whatever, they don't have a retirement public service healthcare plan. And that means every prescription they have to pay out of their own pocket. And that sometimes can be a financial burden for many of them. And that impedes your ability to treat them. And if you say, hey, you need a psychologist, and so, well, I don't have insurance, I can't afford $150 an hour, then what are you going to do? So there are many challenges with the veterans. Now there are 2 classes of veterans. One is people who retire as a 3B, they're medically released, and then the ones who voluntarily release and later on develop mental health issues related to the military. The ones that leave medically have a case manager assigned to them, so they have already a connection into the Veterans Affairs system to expedite certain things. But if you left quote healthy and you develop mental health problems down the line, and you come and see me, let's say, and if you're lucky enough to have a family doctor, and you say, well, you need some treatment. Well, VAC won't give you that because you're not a client. You have to apply to VAC, and then they have to grant you that your mental health was a consequence of military service before they pay any of it. That may take 7 months. Okay? And often it's turned down and you have to appeal and so forth. So in the meantime, what do? Well, if you don't have insurance, not much. And I've got a schizophrenic patient who was released from the military. Waiting for a schizophrenic clinic assessment, it's been 13 months. Okay, that's the waiting list is about 13 months. So in the meantime, at least I'm the family doctor, so I can maintain him. But if you don't, what do? More difficult. Okay, so if you don't have an in somehow, you have to be a client first before they'll do anything, and that takes sometimes a long time. And in the meantime, they're in a bit of a bind, catch-22. So when I look at healthcare, and I've talked about medicine being evidence and healthcare being politics, so there's a lot of politics around this area. And as a physician and Surgeon General, I'm sometimes very uncomfortable with the political debate. Although as a democratic country, we need to have that debate. Sometimes I wonder, though, if some of our veterans become pawns, and the politics often becomes, as is the nature, I guess, of politics, sometimes a bit of a blame game, and you're trying to blame, and most of that is negative, right? I mean, no political party, I guess, wants to praise the government of doing anything good. So it's always negative. And, reality for everybody, I guess, is based upon our own perception of the world. And if you're suffering from mental health, and maybe because that your cognition isn't best in the first place, and all you see is negativity about how horrible the healthcare system is that going to encourage that person to seek care? Or would that cause even for them to withdraw potentially even further? So I'm concerned about the debate being on a more constructive nature on healthcare policies rather than individual, and creating one more barrier for people to seek out care. So in terms of healthcare in general, but mental health care in particular, early self-identification is the key. And every new patient I see, I have an interview with them. And one of the first things I tell my patient is, I can only help you if you're willing to help yourself. Because, this is a democratic country. I can't force treatment on anybody. You have to be wanting to do it. So if you have a system, great, good, or whatever, if you don't access it, or you delay in getting access, you're only going to make yourself worse down the line. And of course, not everything and not everyone can be cured. That's a fact. And there are going to be chronic diseases, as there are chronic diabetes, chronic heart disease, and people with long-term consequences of cancer. And there's lots of chronic diseases around the world. And so you will have chronic mental health cases. And while all chronic cases affect others, mental health particularly affects those people around them, both their families, their colleagues, work buddies, and so on. So it has a much more damaging effect. And therefore, when it's not cured, when things aren't going well, people get very angry, dissatisfied, and they often lash out. And that creates the impression. So that failure to completely and fully treat does not equate to failure or poor care. Sometimes it is what it is, and you have to live with the chronicity for some people. So as we discuss the mental health in particular, we really must keep in mind that the debate over the care of veterans have to be done in a proper basis with a proper emphasis, so that needed political debate does not simply create another burden and another barrier for people who are most vulnerable to seek the care they need at the appropriate time, at the earliest time possible. Okay? So that is the third period ending, and hope that was somewhat interesting. And I think if there's time for questions, I'm willing to entertain some questions, unless you're really hungry and you want to go eat.
Okay, thank you very much, Commodore Dr. Jung, for sharing with us your incredible experiences and also some thought-provoking views. If anyone has questions for him, yes, one of us with a mic will hand you a mic. If you can introduce yourself, that would be wonderful.
My name is, I'm a doctor too. My name is Sunil Bhattrai. I work for a health program in the developing world through DFAD-D. So I'm a senior health advisor for the government. One of the things that your presentation was very interesting, to know the healthcare in the military compared to getting civil care. I heard, I mean, if it is true or not, I'd like to get okay.
I think your voice is
okay.
strong enough.
All right. I heard that in Canadian military, we have increasing numbers of mental health problems. I mean, yes, I understand the blocking of the systems and etc. also in the civilian side, but do you have some kind of more insight in why this is happening? And I heard that also it is happening in proportion far larger enough than what is happening in the civil society, in our Canadian society.
Yeah. So, in fact, all of that information is publicly available on website. In fact, if you go to CIMVHR, Canadian Institute for Military Health Research, there is a section on publications, and the military publishes all this data. And we are part of the Canadian Health Survey, that's Stats Canada, so military has a component there, so we can always compare morbidity and mortalities of healthcare. So overall, based upon the last study, if you have ever served in the military, your overall risk of dying for anything, from cancer, heart, whatever system you want, overall combined, is something like 70% of the general population. So, in fact, having served in the military is actually protective of your health in many ways, okay? Partly because military screens out people who are unhealthy, right? But in terms of overall mental health, I would disagree that it's a higher percentage. In fact, the data shows that. What it is showing, though, is that we're getting a higher number because of the effects of the Afghanistan campaign, okay? And there's a lag time involved, okay? People don't necessarily develop PTSD right away. In fact, the number of people repatriated from theater because of mental health is really small. Okay, I think it's like maybe not even 1%. So a lot of these people develop issues up 3, 4, 5 years down the line. So the PTSD rate now is at, I think it's about 8.5%. But something in the neighborhood of 20% will have some mental health related issues, not just PTSD, but depression, anxiety, a number of other things. So I think there is a bit of a bow wave because of the unique experience of Afghanistan. But on the whole, if you serve in the military, is actually lower in morbidity and mortality in just about every category.
Okay, we had a question from back here. You can introduce yourself.
My name is Nahida Rahman Shumana. I'm Deputy High Commissioner for Bangladesh in Canada. My question is also linked with PTSD. I was just wondering, do you have any research on this, that is it very much in the veterans who came back from abroad, or in the forces who stay in Canada?
Well, most of the PTSD, number one, PTSD is not uniquely military. You could have PTSD because of car accident, you might have experienced a traumatic incident as a child or what have you. Anything that traumatic that really overwhelmed your senses can lead to PTSD. And of course, as you can imagine, combat is a very potentially traumatic effect because people are actually trying to kill you. So the military PTSD is very much, vast majority are combat related. Okay. Now there are other people in the military who have PTSD because of childhood abuse, who have had car accidents and so on and so forth. But most of the military members who have PTSD is because they experience horrific experience often in combat in Afghanistan.
Thank you.
So, Major Samson, I have a question regarding to the diversity in the Canadian Forces. A few years ago, I volunteered to be a recruiter for a day in Toronto, and it's amazing. I get a question from the parents. I say, the first question that comes to me, they would ask, how did they treat you in the military? Will they sing you out, and will you pick on you, things like that? And what you say that is true because I came from Asian country, most Asian country, from my own experience, doesn't have very good background in terms of government entity. Such as military, police force, they are the tool of oppression. So last thing they want a kid is to join the military themselves. So it was surprising when they say, now, in fact, I experienced racism, or at least one perception anyway, a lot less when I want to work in the armed forces. A few friends of mine that they actually threatened to disown them if they join the military. My parents, the same things, had to go to a whole bunch of books to convince them that the Canadian Forces is not the same as the force we see in our country. I was a refugee when I came to Canada 34 years ago. I'm kind of curious, when you decided to join the armed forces, how would your parents react?
Well, so I think Korean families are a little bit different. Because of the Korean War and the importance of the military in fighting the communist encroachment in those days, the Cold War having started. So because of that experience of Korean War and of course UN and Canadian soldiers involved in it, I don't believe the military has the same negative connotation. I think it's seen more or less as a fairly honorable profession that in service of your country. So when I decided to join, my parents were absolutely happy. They had absolutely zero objections whatsoever, and they lived through Korean War. They know what it was to be subjugated and so forth. So the idea that I would join a military, Canadian military, it's not an oppressive government. We're about freedom and so forth. To be able to, play my role in that, they were very, very proud that I joined the military. And I say to people, look. People often are worried about, racism or some kind of discrimination. And, most of the immigrants, they were probably discriminated in their own country anyway, right? And I'm not saying that to justify discrimination, but as I said, life is not fair, right? You gotta get over it. And my experience is that, did I experience racism in the military? Yes, I did. But you know what? I think it's less than if I was in the civilian sector, because military is about meritocracy. The beauty of military is that you don't have to work with the same boss very long. Either it's you or your boss gets moved out. So if you work for a civilian company or a public servant, where you can say, I love what I'm doing, I'm not going to move. So if you have a boss who's there for 30 years and doesn't want to move, and you just happen to, and that person doesn't like you, what are you going to do? You have to move somewhere, right? But in the military, it's not like that, because even if somebody didn't like you, the military structure is, I'm in this position for about 3 years. I need to demonstrate my own performance that I've done something useful in those 3 years. So you don't have time to pick and choose. You want to maximize the effort of your subordinates no matter who. And you have to work together as a teamwork to do that. Because only if you have good team members working for you and you treat them well and they perform, do you look good. And then you can get promoted. So even if maybe they don't like you, they have to treat you well if they want to love you. So it's a bit of a self-serving in some ways. But even if you didn't get along, chances are within about 18 months, one of you are going to be moving. And so you have a new boss who's going to hopefully see that value. So I see the military as there's a built-in structure to promote meritocracy. And I have, obviously I'm an example because I rose through the system. But when people say, oh my God, there's racism, well, tell me where there isn't one. Again, that's not justification that you should tolerate it. But that's my talk about if you have adversity, you got to work even harder to demonstrate to people that their perception is wrong, rather than saying, poor me, life is not fair, I'm entitled, where's my right? I'm more about your responsibility, you working hard, overcoming and showing people that in fact their judgment was wrong. And that's the best way to overcome, discrimination of any sort at the end of the day, right?
Any other questions? Yes. Here.
Hi, my name is Margaret. I'm with National Defense. I was a former reservist for 12 years. I'm just curious, as a Surgeon General, do you get involved in the healthcare of the reservists, or the statistics include the reservists?
Yes, I mean, obviously, by the National Defense Act and so forth, Class B and Class C reservists are under the purview of the Surgeon General. Class A's are not. So if you have a Class A, you have a family doctor, civilian side. So if you're Class B and Class C, absolutely, you're part of the healthcare team. And so all the things we have, all the programs that we have, it's equally accessible. The only difficulty in statistics is there are no easy way to capture reservists. For example, every time there's somebody who dies in a car accident, whatever it is, he served in the military. Well, he might have served one summer as the reserve and the ceremonial guards. Or somebody may have joined and never paraded, but they're still considered a reservist. So it's very hard to tell who is a reservist in terms of are they truly military.
Or active reserve.
Yeah, active reserve. There's no number. It doesn't show up. And often people go in and out, right? So it's not that we don't want to. It's almost impossible to capture it based upon the methodological hurdles you have to go through. So even like, for example, suicide. We know how many reservists commit suicide. Well, we think we do. Because if you're a reservist on the books, there are people who are reservists who've never paraded like 3-4 years and nobody's taking them off the book. So we don't know if they're reservists unless somebody tells us they're reservists. And we don't know what's the denominator. Because there's a huge number and not everyone is active. Okay?
Or how active.
Or how active, yeah.
And I'm also curious to know, I have friends that I still kind of occasionally keep contact with, and they are no longer in active service,
right.
So they're former reservists.
Right.
So if they have a medical condition like something like anxiety, and it could be attributed to their current job, it could be attributed to their former military service.
Right.
Is there a mechanism in place that,
yes.
that you can evaluate, the Surgeon General or someone could evaluate?
There is a system, but it's a long and arduous system.
I imagine so.
Yeah, it's not the Surgeon General, because by the time, once you're no longer there, let's say you're lucky enough to have a family doctor. Let's say that family doctor knows about the veteran system. So you have to assess the individual. And if the doctor says, you know what, you're experiencing anxiety because of your current life stresses, maybe you got divorced or somebody in your family is sick and so forth, that's one. But if you say, you know what, maybe it's due to maybe you were deployed 10 years ago to somewhere. Now, is the civilian doctor going to even know the right question to ask? That how many people say, when you take the history, have you ever served in the military? What kind of operation did you do? Most family doctors wouldn't even know to ask that question. Okay? So if you as a reservist bring that, well, could you think it could be because of so-and-so? Then that doctor has to make a reasonable conclusion that it may be.
A decision. Yes.
Then that member, as I said, now has to apply to VAC to have the person's case adjudicated. That means you have to find all your old documents, everything, supply all the evidence
So
for them.
it's a long.
It's a long, arduous process, as I said.
I'm just curious
Yeah.
because I'm still in contact with some people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have one of the last questions on that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay, two more. Let's
two more? Okay, for sure. You can go first and then we'll...
Okay. I'm Ling Wang from National Defense too. When I was very young, I was always puzzled by these questions because nowadays more and more people have mental disease. I don't know, is there any gap between old generation and the young generation? Is more the young generation most vulnerable to mental disease?
I don't think so. Diseases mental health is a little bit trickier because, for example, if you're diabetic, okay, you don't have to say, I think I am diabetic, or I'm not diabetic. You just do a blood test and you say, yeah, you're diabetic. Whether you believe it or not, you are, okay? Mental health is different because it's how you perceive, because it's subjective how you feel it. So, I don't know if there are statistics, but when you consider how many Holocaust victims there were, you would think with that kind of adversity, there'd be almost 100% PTSD rate. And there may be, but for some reason, to my best understanding, most of those people still have led a very productive life. So I think there probably is some inoculation. If you grow up with lots of adversity, one more adversity is not as big of a change. But if you grow up very protected in a very safe environment, all of a sudden your life turns upside down, that's a huge change. And that may have a more impact. So it's not so it's generation in the sense that the younger generation have led a more peaceful and safe and more comfortable life. But it's not because of inherently that generation, but it's the society at that time, right?
Okay, thank you.
Hi, sir. Lieutenant Commander Suzanne Appleton. Thank you very much. The preceding point was actually a good segue into my question, which is, do you think that there's any place for a more robust resiliency training regime within the military? And my second point is that I don't blame you for missing the naval uniform.
Resiliency that's a very, very interesting question, and that's something that's there's not a whole lot of research, okay? And so, number one, how do you do that in life? How close to reality can you get? Obviously, memory, muscle memory, right? So all airmen, soldiers, and sailors undergo through repetitive training, so that when something happens, you have muscle memory, so you can react instantaneously. And closer you can get to the real battle situation, more likely you're going to react the way you were trained. So that's in a battle scenario. The question is, can you do that from a mental health training? Can you take people and throw them especially now with technology, in a virtual reality where there's all kinds of guts and gore out there? And the question becomes, maybe that itself will cause PTSD, So, because if it's too realistic, you may develop PTSD because of that. So there's not a whole lot of research. People are trying, but I think the best resiliency is not training. This is not so much as research, but I think it's my gut feel, is that best resilience comes from your upbringing. If you have a good, warm family where you felt protected, where you felt loved, and you learned your way through. And I think that kind of training, gives you the sense of, I think, resilience, that you have family of support. Whereas if you grew up alone, lonely, vulnerable, not trusting, and you have no one to turn to, more likely, when something does happen, they have less resources to, buttress them, right? So that's why when you talk about, unlike physical medicine, even though we ask people, for example, is there anybody else in the family who's diabetic, that kind of stuff, is there a history of heart disease? Mental health is even more important. That's why you talk about, does your mother love you? The usual story. How did you grow up? Was there any problems with your childhood, developmental? So resiliency is your life experience up to that point, and whether or not that experience has been positive one, that you can address the issues, versus less than positive. So I'm somewhat pessimistic of some miraculous 1 week course is suddenly going to give you this huge resiliency. No, I don't think so. I think resilience is you built into it. What the training does is, if you experience certain things, it's an education, then maybe that's not normal. You shouldn't hide it. It's an education format. Just like if you have your throat hurts, your shoulder hurts, you're sweating, you feel nauseous, well, maybe it's not indigestion. Maybe you're having a heart attack. It's that education, so that if you are exposed to something and you are developing adverse mental health reaction, understanding the nuanced symptoms and understanding how you're changing may be the best way to identify early, to seek intervention early, so you can actually go back. And in my practice, I have lots of people with PTSD who are fully functioning. They're working full time and and so forth. There's no problem. But it's chronic. They know that certain things can trigger them, so they've learned to work around that. Right? So it's not a death sentence by any means. The argument is, if you have an issue, early identification, like any disease, early treatment more likely will lead to better resolution. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Commodore Dr. Jung, for sharing with us your time. Before we move on, though. Before we move on, I would like to